Hello, my friends. D.L. Anderson here. Welcome back to Transformation by Truth podcast as we share the truth concerning these last days and what you must do to save yourself from the violent times that are just ahead. Today's podcast is a word of truth accounting of the end times. The end is coming. The end is near. Today's podcast is entitled End Times 534, The Impact of Ignorance and Deception, Part 4, How Misconception and Noncompliance Defeat the Spirit of Compliance Within Your Mind. The podcast objectives are reveal why you must stop ignorance early in its progression, revisit the downfall of those who question Elohim, analyze how misconception reinforces disobedience, and analyze the impact of misconception within your mind. Welcome. Now, before we begin today's lesson, I would like to welcome all my beloved brothers and sisters in Yahushua Messiah who have been scattered to the four corners of the earth, who Yahuwah has joined to this ministry for such a time as this. I would also like to welcome anyone who is engaging our podcasts or videos for the first time. We trust you were led by the set apart spirit in finding us. And if you continue to be led, we hope you stay with us. For these are troubling times, and an evil day is just ahead. To this end, if you are watching this video on YouTube and you have not subscribed to our channel, click the subscribe button below, and you will be alerted whenever we post new videos. Also, if you have any questions at the conclusion of this video, you can ask them using the link in the podcast description below the video player. Last but not least, if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up so YouTube can share it with believers like us. There will always be the next battle. Shalom, my beloved brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 498 of our exposition of lawlessness. Last week, we progressed our analysis of the impact of ignorance and deception, and we came to see how disregard and despair win the first series of battles in the Second Great War of your mind. In doing so, they eliminate hope, which sets off a chain reaction of death within your thought dimension. You can see this by observing the image to the right. As you can clearly see, disregard feeds into despair, which eliminates all hope from your mind. This leads to the downfall of your renewed personality, your physical perspective, and your emotions. And this is the beginning of the deadly chain reaction within your mind. Now, as bad as this situation is, there is a path you can follow to mitigate the regression you have started. And hear me carefully as I say, you must find it. Here is why. If you fail to stop the progression of ignorance at this interval, you will never stop it. The reason why is sure, and we will analyze it in this podcast. That said, you must appreciate the fact that you will have an opportunity to undo the damage of disregard and despair, and you must take it. My dear friends, you must remember this. As long as you are on this quest, there will always be the next battle. And sometimes the next battle is not a battle the enemy brings to you. On the rather, It's a battle you bring to the enemy. Now, we will talk about the path you must follow to defeat, disregard, and despair in a future podcast. For now, the Ruach of Elohim is leading me to continue analyzing the progression of ignorance and deception and what happens when you fail to stop this progression while you have the chance. For the damage of ignorance is not finished. The damage of ignorance is not done. Let's get started. The tribulation continues and the suffering never ends. Now, first things first, you must remember that the progression of ignorance and deception is not aligned with the progression of disobedience and doubt. And since the former is driving the latter, ignorance and deception take precedence over disobedience and doubt. Ergo, the progression evolves from disregard and despair to misconception and noncompliance. You can see this by analyzing the table below. To wit, the progression evolves from one level of the questioning to the next. Now, we learned many things about the questioning in phase one, and if you recall, none of it was good. Besides the obvious fact that the questioning lays a foundation for doubt and disobedience within your mind, the questioning is, more often than not, initiated by the enemy, who you will find is trying to force his thoughts into your mind. Now, if you recall, we analyzed this matter in End Times 402, The Spiritual Disease of Contempt, Part 2, which was posted on January 10th, 2025. In that podcast, we analyzed how the serpent caused the woman to transgress the command of Elohim. To wit, he got her to question Elohim, and in doing so, he was able to make his thoughts her thoughts. This led to manipulation, which led to withdrawal, which led to transgression, which led to opposition, which led to separation. That said, I would encourage you to re-engage that podcast because the enemy is using the same playbook. My dear friends, this speaks to the spiritual insanity within the dying nation of Israel. Get this, the majority of men and women within this nation are so spiritually inept, the enemy is only using a minor fraction of his playbook to destroy our people. And what is worse, he uses the same playbook on the same people, which is why many of our people are repeat offenders, for they are being controlled by spiritual strongholds that are very powerful in operation and yet very simple to construct. The point I'm trying to make is this: there are inherent defects within men that result in constant tribulations and much suffering for the transgressors and for those around them. And after all this time, from the very beginning of man's day, the tribulation continues and the suffering never ends. The trail of death misconception leaves behind. Now, there are many reasons why tribulation and suffering are primary features of man's day, and they all evolve from the questioning. Vis-a-vis, the first play in Satan's playbook is the questioning. Ergo, if you can resist the questioning, then you're in business. And here again, we will analyze that path in a future podcast. But for now, we must analyze what happens when you don't take this path. Listen to me. Disregard has cracked open the door into your mind, for misconception was knocking, and now she is going to come in. Now, this is a crucial setback for your mind in many ways, but none are as crucial as the following revelation. Consider this, my friends, and be advised. Misconception has the power to reinstate noncompliance within your thought dimension. This allows the enemy to reestablish a stronghold of disobedience within your mind, even though the progression of doubt is not finished. Now, here again, this is not the same scenario you faced during the first great war of your mind. And as you have likely gathered, it is because complacency is already in play. As I say, the progressions of ignorance and deception are only effective if complacency is already in play. Now, let me tell you something. This is a very dangerous maneuver in any terms of warfare. Vis-a-vis, the invading army is so powerful, the enemy nation doesn't wait for them to complete their invasion. On the rather, the enemy nation enters as soon as the first invasion is complete. This is crucial, for it allows the enemy nation to begin constructing strongholds immediately. And in the case of deception, the enemy is desperate to build strongholds immediately. Here is why. You cannot escape the progression of deception once it has started. Ergo, every stronghold forged by deception will be secure prior to the conclusion of the progression. And the first stronghold of deception will be pushed by misconception. Along these lines, we came to see how the quickest path to developing misconceptions is by disregarding key aspects of Yahuwah's will, which is why disregard leads to misconceptions. In this order, disregard forces you to work with incomplete data. It's like trying to work a puzzle without all the pieces. Not only this, but you are missing some of the most important pieces. This increases the complexity of the puzzle, which in turn increases the likelihood that you will develop misconceptions, which increases the likelihood that you will eventually give up, which is what the enemy is betting on. Now, even though misconceptions are designed to complicate the mind, she does not build strongholds within your mind. Remember, deception desires to control your will. Your mind is just the first stop on his path. That said, the question we should chiefly entertain is this: if disregard is designed to neutralize hope and reinstate the stronghold of despair within your mind, what trail of death does misconception leave behind? The answer is sure, and I touched on it earlier in this section. Vis-a-vis, misconception is designed to reinstate the spirit of noncompliance, i.e., the fundamental degree of disobedience. And in doing so, she will neutralize the spirit of compliance, i.e., the fundamental degree of obedience. The same way disregard neutralized hope, i.e., the fundamental degree of faith. Now, if you were paying attention during phase one, then you know how important compliance is in your quest. And although no one degree of holiness is more important than the other. Some operations are more critical at key intervals than the rest. No doubt, compliance is one of these degrees. Ergo, any situation where compliance is neutralized is a big deal, for it will have major implications in your spiritual success. Let's talk about it. You are bleeding the power to resist. Now, first of all, we can validate this matter by utilizing the linear model of holiness. Along these lines, to deregulate your mind, ignorance and deception must first neutralize the fundamental degrees of obedience and faith. In this order, disregard and despair have already neutralized hope, i.e., the fundamental degree of faith. Ergo, misconception must now neutralize compliance, i.e., the fundamental degree of obedience, which is why she teams up with non-compliance. Simple enough. Now, if you recall, compliance causes you to fall in line with the spiritual standard of Yahushua Messiah. This positions you to take the next step in your quest, which all but guarantees your spiritual success as you are being transformed into his righteousness. Now, this is where misconception comes onto the scene. Vis-a-vis, misconception prevents you from taking the next step in your quest by deceiving you into migrating outside of the way of holiness without appreciating that you are migrating outside of the way of holiness. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, this is huge. To wit, misconception as a degree of deception has the power to switch scenes on you. Alas, 1 minute you're on the right path, and the next minute you are getting off the beaten path without realizing that you are getting off the beaten path. Now, from what you learned in phase 1, this should not be possible. To wit, you should never be able to get off the beaten path without knowing it. Here is why. Every occasion in which you begin to deviate from the way of holiness is accompanied by a sharp spiritual resistance, which results in discomfort. This sharp resistance is a clear indicator that you are diverging from the beaten path. You, my friend, are getting out of line. That said, the question of the hour is quite simply this: how can misconception switch scenes on you and eliminate the sharp resistance that comes naturally when you deviate from the way of holiness? The answer is sure, and there are 2 layers to it. Now, the first layer is the more critical layer. To wit, we first learned that there is a sharp spiritual resistance when you deviate from the way of holiness in End Times 374, an intro to compliance, which was posted on November 20th, 2024. That, my friends, is what we call a hint. To wit, resistance is a feature of compliance. You learn this in End Times 374, an intro to compliance, which I strongly encourage you to listen to again if you can find the time. Along these lines, this podcast reveals the primary illustration of compliance. Enter an elastic suit, which is the primary piece of clothing you wear in your quest. Not only this, but every feature within the whole armor of Elohim evolves from your elastic suit of compliance. And thus, any deviation from the will of Elohim will always be met with some manner of spiritual resistance. Always. Here lies the problem. To wit, misconception is in league with noncompliance, and their first order of business is to eliminate the spirit of compliance so they can strip you of your elastic suit and all your spiritual armor. Now, this brings us to the second layer of the aforementioned paradox, vis-a-vis the scenario where you deviate from the way of holiness, and yet you do not experience the sharp spiritual resistance that comes when you deviate from the way of holiness. Now, the reason why you will not feel the sharp resistance is sure, vis-a-vis the operations of compliance have been compromised. The question then is, how did misconception and noncompliance neutralize the spirit of compliance? The answer again is sure. It's because you have been infected with disregard, which reinfected you with despair and complacency. Here is why this is such a huge issue when it comes to compliance. Disregard dealt a death blow to compliance before misconception came onto the scene. For disregard causes you to ignore some facet, i.e., standard of Yahuwah's will. And it is impossible to comply with Yahuwah's will and at the same time disregard his will. Now, that was the inflection. Here is the problem. Vis-a-vis, the moment disregard invaded your mind, your resistance to lawlessness began to decline. And this, my friends, is why you will not feel the sharp spiritual resistance when you deviate from the way of holiness. It is because your resistance has been in decline from the very start, which is why the spirit of compliance at this interval will not be able to play her part. No doubt, this is where misconception comes onto the scene hard and fast, and you will see it clearly if you reconsider a definition of misconception. Once more, please. By definition, a misconception is an idea that is wrong because it is based on an erroneous interpretation of a situation, which results in confusion and misunderstanding. My dear friends, I hope you can see how it is now all coming together. To wit, misconceptions are based upon an erroneous interpretation of a situation. This is how she can switch scenes on you. Look here. Whilst you deviate from the way of holiness, misconception deceives you with an erroneous interpretation of the situation, and you cannot resist her, for you are bleeding the power to resist. And in no time, the spirit of noncompliance will reconstruct her strongholds in order for ignorance to resume her progression. And it's all because you would not deal with complacency and disregard, which opened you up to misconception. This is the impact of noncompliance and misconception. And yet, the damage of deception is not finished. The damage of deception is not done. Now, here is the final word. You'll find you're getting nowhere fast when you get off the beaten path. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, we have analyzed many deceptions of the enemy. And yet, there are not many that rise to the level of the matters we discussed today. Look here. When the enemy begins pushing ignorance and deception into your thoughts, it's just a matter of time. For they are wholly intent on controlling your will, and thus they are wholly intent on you losing your mind. Heretofore, I recommend don't lose compliance and don't lose hope. For without them, you have no foundation for resisting the onslaught of ignorance and deception and a reservation within the dying nation. Now, here is today's assignment. Meditate on today's lesson. And if you have any questions, please submit them using the form at pinnacleofholiness.com. And I will respond to you as soon as I can. Now, here is what's next. We completed today's podcast, End Times 534, The Impact of Ignorance and Deception, Part 4. And the next podcast is entitled End Times 535, The Impact of Ignorance and Deception, Part 5. I will post this podcast on Wednesday, November 12th, 2025. Until then, my friends, continue to be led by the Spirit of Elohim. Continue to watch, continue to pray, continue in fasting, and most of all, continue to be focused, for the end is coming. The end is near.